The Gaza Strip, a sliver of land on the Mediterranean coast, is a place etched with the scars of a seemingly endless conflict. This tiny territory, home to over 2 million Palestinians, has been a focal point of the Arab-Israeli conflict for decades. To understand the current crisis, we must delve into the historical currents that have brought us to this point. The roots of the conflict lie in the aftermath of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Many of these refugees fled to Gaza, which came under Egyptian control. Israel occupied Gaza in the 1967 Six-Day War, setting the stage for decades of military occupation and Palestinian resistance. The First Intifada, which began in 1987, marked a turning point. Palestinian frustration with Israeli occupation boiled over into widespread protests and clashes. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s offered a glimmer of hope, promising a path to Palestinian self-governance. However, the peace process ultimately faltered, leaving behind a legacy of broken promises and simmering resentment. The situation deteriorated further in 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. While hailed by some as a step towards peace, the withdrawal did little to address the underlying issues of the conflict. Gaza remained under an Israeli blockade, its borders tightly controlled, and its economy crippled. It was in this pressure cooker of despair and frustration that Hamas, a militant Islamist group, rose to power in 2007. The current crisis erupted with shocking brutality on October 7th when Hamas militants launched a surprise attack on Israel. The assault, unprecedented in its scale and audacity, involved a multi-pronged incursion across the Gaza border. Militants infiltrated Israeli towns, engaging in fierce firefights with Israeli forces and taking hostages. The images that flashed across the world were both horrifying and heart-wrenching. Videos surfaced on social media showing Hamas fighters firing on civilians and dragging bodies through the streets. The attacks sent shockwaves through Israel, shattering any semblance of normalcy and evoking painful memories of past conflicts. Israel, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack, quickly mobilized its military. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his voice trembling with anger and grief, vowed a swift and devastating response. "Hamas will pay an unprecedented price," he declared, as Israeli jets roared into the skies above Gaza. The October 7th attack marked a dangerous escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It shattered the fragile status quo that had prevailed for years, plunging the region into a new and terrifying chapter of violence. The world watched with bated breath, uncertain of what the coming days would bring, but bracing for the worst. Israel's response to the Hamas attack was swift and merciless. Within hours of the first rocket fire, Israeli warplanes were pounding targets across the Gaza Strip. The roar of jets filled the skies as bombs rained down on what Israel described as Hamas military infrastructure, including tunnels, weapons depots, and command centers. The strikes, however, were not confined to military targets. The densely populated Gaza Strip, where civilians and combatants live in close proximity, meant that civilian casualties were inevitable. Homes were reduced to rubble, hospitals overwhelmed with the wounded, and terrified families huddled in fear as the bombs fell around them. The Israeli Defense Forces maintained that it was doing everything possible to minimize civilian casualties, accusing Hamas of using civilians as human shields. The IDF pointed to its practice of dropping leaflets warning residents to evacuate targeted areas as evidence of its commitment to avoiding civilian harm. Despite these assurances, the death toll in Gaza mounted rapidly. International organizations, including the United Nations, expressed alarm at the rising civilian casualties, urging both sides to exercise restraint and allow humanitarian aid to reach those in need. But the calls for de-escalation went unheeded as the cycle of violence continued to spin. Section 4. The Killing Fields, Escalation, and the Mounting Death Toll. As the days turned into weeks, the conflict escalated with terrifying speed. The skies above Gaza glowed red with the constant barrage of Israeli airstrikes, while Hamas continued to fire rockets indiscriminately into Israel. The streets of Gaza, once bustling with life, were transformed into a desolate landscape of rubble and ruin. The death toll on both sides continued to rise, each casualty adding fuel to the fire of hatred and revenge. The world watched in horror as the conflict claimed the lives of innocent civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Hospitals, already struggling to cope with the influx of wounded, faced shortages of essential medicines and supplies. International efforts to broker a ceasefire faltered, as neither side seemed willing to back down. Hamas demanded an end to the Israeli blockade of Gaza, while Israel insisted on the return of its hostages and guarantees that Hamas would be disarmed. The two sides remained locked in a deadly embrace, each determined to fight to the bitter end. Amidst the carnage and destruction, stories of human resilience and compassion emerged. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save lives, often risking their own in the process. Ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire showed extraordinary courage and humanity, helping their neighbors and sharing what little food and water they had. But even these acts of kindness could not mask the brutal reality of a conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. Section 5. Sinwar's demise, a turning point in the conflict. On October 18th, amidst the escalating violence, news broke that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, had been killed in an Israeli airstrike. Sinwar, a shadowy figure known for his hardline stance against Israel, had been a key target of the Israeli military since the beginning of the conflict. His death, confirmed by Hamas officials, was met with jubilation in Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu hailed it as a major victory, claiming that Sinwar's demise would severely weaken Hamas and deter future attacks. "The head of the snake has been cut off," he declared, "and we will continue to strike at the heart of this terrorist organization until it is destroyed." The impact of Sinwar's death on the conflict, however, remained uncertain. Some analysts argued that it could potentially create an opportunity for a ceasefire, as Hamas might be more willing to negotiate from a position of weakness. Others, however, warned that Sinwar's death could lead to even greater instability, as different factions within Hamas jockey for power and potentially escalate the violence in a bid to prove their strength. The international community reacted cautiously to the news of Sinwar's death, with many world leaders expressing hope that it could pave the way for a ceasefire, while also urging restraint from both sides. The coming days would be crucial in determining whether Sinwar's death would prove to be a turning point in the conflict, or simply another chapter in a long and bloody saga.